From being buried up to your neck and pelted with stones to executions carried out on children's soccer fields, the way countries enforce the ultimate punishment is as shocking as it is brutal. Some methods are swift, others are drawn-out nightmares. This is what death row executions look like around the world, and some of these methods will leave you absolutely speechless. Starting with the USA. While the United States hands out many death sentences each year, surprisingly, it doesn't even rank in the top 10 globally. Around 20 people are sentenced to death row annually, but not all of them meet their fate. In many states, the death penalty is outright illegal, while in others, it remains legal, but is never practiced. However, 11 states actively carry out death sentences. Inmates receive death sentences for various crimes, most commonly homicide-related offenses, but also for espionage, treason, and, in extreme cases, narcotics trafficking. The USA employs 5 execution methods, varying by state: lethal injection, electric chair, firing squad, gas chamber, and gas asphyxiation. But what actually happens to an inmate in their final hours? Exactly 24 hours before the execution, the inmate is taken from their regular cell and moved to what is grimly known as the death house. This serves as their last time outside. Upon arrival, they undergo a full-body search and are given new clothing before being led to their final holding cell, known as the Death Watch cell. Here, the inmate spends their final night. Some try to sleep, though many are unable to, as they are haunted by what is coming. At the 15-hour mark, they are woken up and given a final shower before receiving a standard prison breakfast. 14 hours before the execution, they are permitted one last visit with friends and family, followed by 45 minutes to make any final phone calls. This serves as their last contact with the outside world. At the 12-hour mark, all visitations are cut off. The inmate is then given a regular prison lunch and offered the chance to speak with a priest, imam, or spiritual advisor. Many take this opportunity to confess regrets, seek forgiveness, or find peace before their final moments. At the 8-hour mark, they are allowed to watch the sunset one last time. With 6 hours left, the inmate writes their final letters, leaving behind messages to loved ones. Then comes their last meal. Despite common belief, they cannot order anything they want. It must be within a $30 budget. With today's prices, their options are extremely limited. After this, if their execution is by electric chair, their head will be shaved to prevent their hair from catching fire. At the 3-hour mark, witnesses begin arriving. These are usually the victim's relatives, though sometimes the inmate's family attends as well. 1 hour before execution, the inmate is escorted to the death chamber by a 5-guard team. They are strapped to a chair or bed as the witnesses take their seats in the one-way viewing room. The inmate isn't able to see them. At the 10-minute mark, they are allowed to say their last words, followed by one final visit from a priest or imam. Then, the execution takes place. Currently, over 2,500 people await execution on death row in the United States. Due to extensive appeal processes, executions often take decades. However, this wasn't always the case. Perhaps the grimmest execution conducted by the country was that of George Stinney, a 14-year-old African-American boy accused of killing 2 white girls. He was so small that he had to sit on a Bible in the electric chair. Since 2005, this has changed. Now, inmates must be at least 18 years old to receive a death sentence. The execution process in the USA is long, methodical, and chilling, yet it remains one of the most controversial practices in modern justice systems worldwide. Next up, Somalia. Somalia is known as one of the most dangerous countries in the world. In an effort to combat rising crime, the nation enforces one of the harshest punishments: public execution. Unlike most countries that conduct executions behind prison walls, Somalia remains one of the few where death is a spectacle, carried out in full view of the public. The country uses 3 methods of executing prisoners: hanging, firing squad, and stoning. On average, around 13 people are executed each year. Death sentences are handed down for crimes such as homicide, treason, espionage, and military desertion. But it doesn't stop there. In Somalia, you can also be sentenced to death for leaving Islam, committing blasphemy, adultery, or being in a same-gender relationship. Waiting for execution in Somalia is a nightmare of its own. Inmates spend their final days trapped in overcrowded, filthy prison cells, suffocating in unbearable heat with barely any ventilation. The air is thick with sweat and fear as prisoners wait for their names to be called, knowing that it will be the last time. Their fate is already sealed. Before the execution even takes place, their graves have already been dug. Some executions take place in open fields near the prison, where inmates are lined up and shot by a firing squad. Others, however, unfold in a setting so disturbing that it's hard to believe. In the Somali capital of Mogadishu, a stretch of pristine white sand meets the brilliant blue waves of the Indian Ocean. Tourists might mistake it for a postcard-perfect paradise. But for those who live here, this beach serves a far more deadly purpose. 6 tall concrete posts have been planted in the sand, a grim and silent reminder of what is happening here. Every so often, men are brought to this spot, tied to the posts with plastic ropes, their heads covered with black hoods. Then, without ceremony, guns are fired until there is nothing left. But the most chilling part is that these very same posts are used as goalposts when children play soccer on the beach. No effort is made to clean up the area. The bloodstains fade into the sand, the graves of the executed scattered nearby around the beach. While only journalists are invited to officially witness the executions, nobody stops the locals from gathering. What's worse is that there's no one stopping the kids from watching these horrors as well, but that might have been the plan all along. This beach was chosen as an execution site in 1975 by then-President Siad Barre, specifically because it was a place where the public could watch and learn. Even decades later, the message remains the same. In Somalia, death is not just a punishment, it's a spectacle. Moving on to China. China has been branded the world's worst executioner, carrying out more state-sanctioned killings than the rest of the world combined. Every year, thousands are put to death, some for violent crimes, others for white-collar offenses, drug charges, or even political disputes. Once arrested, there is little hope of escape. China's conviction rate is a staggering 99%, meaning nearly every defendant who stands trial is doomed. And for those sentenced to death, the execution is often swift and surrounded by secrecy. China primarily uses 2 methods of execution: lethal injection and firing squads. Firing squads were supposedly discontinued in 2010, but reports suggest they are still in use. Lethal injection, on the other hand, has taken over as the preferred method, not because it's more humane, but because it's cheaper and more discreet. But China has introduced something even more unsettling: mobile execution vans. These unmarked vehicles, which appear to be ordinary police vans, are in reality rolling death chambers. These are converted 24-seat buses with a windowless chamber where the execution itself takes place. Inside, a prisoner is strapped to a bed, an IV inserted into their arm. At the press of a button, a lethal injection is administered, and within minutes, they are dead. No need for prison transport. No need for an execution ground. These vans allow roaming death squads to eliminate prisoners on the move, making executions quicker and harder to track. Several CCTV cameras are also present in the van, meaning the execution can be recorded or watched if officials desire to monitor it. One of the most horrifying aspects of China's death penalty system is what happens after the execution. It is widely believed that prisoners' organs are harvested without consent and then sold or used for medical research. In 2009, the government admitted that over 65% of organ transplants in China came from executed prisoners. The real number could be even higher. China's legal system allows the death penalty for an astonishing range of crimes. People can be executed for fraud, bribery, rioting, piracy, smuggling people into China, separatism, rebellion, subversion, aircraft hijacking, espionage, and even endangering national security. The list is long, vague, and ever-expanding, making nearly anyone a potential target. Life in a Chinese prison before execution is a punishment in itself. Inmates endure grueling conditions, often forced to work up to 16 hours a day. They must shave their heads, avoid eye contact with guards, and obey strict, dehumanizing rules. Some prisoners are kept in complete isolation. Others are housed in overcrowded cells where fear and uncertainty fill every moment. For those who find themselves on death row in China, the end is often swift and silent. A trial, a conviction, an execution, sometimes all within days. Next on the list is North Korea. If you think China is bad, wait till you hear about North Korea. The country is known for its public executions, which are designed to instill fear. They are brutal, calculated, and shrouded in secrecy. Very little is known about the trials that precede them, but what is clear is that justice is not the goal. Control is. In North Korea, prisoners don't linger on death row. Their trials are swift, often taking place a few moments before execution, and these so-called hearings rarely last more than a few minutes. The prosecutor reads the charges charges, and the accused are given a chance to speak. Most beg for mercy, pleading for another chance. But mercy is never an option. According to testimonies, the judge delivers the same cold declaration to everyone. He says, "This is not a matter of forgiveness. It is a crime against the Constitution and the law of the land. He must die." And just like that, the verdict is final. The condemned is then taken behind a screen to be prepared. A senior police or public security official announces the crime and punishment to the gathered crowd, reinforcing the lesson. This is what happens to traitors, thieves, and those who dare to defy the regime. Occasionally, a prisoner is granted final words, but most are silenced. These executions are not random. They are meticulously planned. The state ensures people know when and where they will happen. Posters are plastered on walls, billboards, and even inside workplaces. Some executions are announced over the radio, listing the prisoner's name, birthplace, education, and crime. Notices are displayed days, sometimes weeks in advance. Attendance isn't officially mandatory, but many believe they have a duty to witness the execution. Entire workplaces are ordered to attend. Local officials are present, and even children often stand in the crowd, watching. The executions themselves are cold and methodical. Prisoners are blindfolded, their arms, legs, and even torsos tightly bound with rope. Some have their mouths taped shut to stifle their final cries. They are led to makeshift platforms, wooden poles, or even the backs of trucks, many already half-conscious from severe beatings. Some bodies bear clear signs of torture. Shooting squads, typically 4 to 6 policemen, are brought in from other towns, ensuring they have no personal connection to the condemned. Each executioner is assigned a precise target: the head, the chest, or the limbs. In at least one case, a prisoner was strung up by a rope, and one executioner was ordered to shoot the rope, sending the lifeless body crashing into a waiting cart. Hanging is another method of execution used in North Korea. In some cases, bodies are left dangling for days, a grotesque warning for all who pass by. More often, however, they are quickly disposed of. Prisoners are thrown into carts and taken away. What happens next is unknown. Families are rarely, if ever, allowed to claim the remains. Moving on to Saudi Arabia. Every year, Saudi Arabia ends hundreds of lives, averaging over 185 executions annually. Death sentences are handed down not just for violent crimes, but for offenses that in other parts of the world might not even warrant prison time. Burglary, treason, espionage, and drug-related charges can all lead to execution. Leaving Islam, adultery, same-gender relationships, even accusations of witchcraft can end in a public execution. The kingdom has 3 primary methods of execution, each being extremely brutal: beheadings, firing squads, and stonings. Firing squads, while rare, are still used when swordsmen are unavailable. Stoning is reserved for those convicted of adultery, a punishment as medieval as it is horrifying. The condemned is buried up to their chest or neck in sand, rendered completely immobile. Then the stones begin to fly, hurled by those gathered to witness the execution. But the most common method, and the one that has come to define Saudi Arabia's justice system, is beheading. The executioner, a trained swordsman known as a sayyaf, wields a curved sword designed for a single strike. Islamic doctrine dictates that the execution must be swift, a clean slice through the neck to ensure minimal suffering, but not all beheadings go smoothly. There have been cases where it took multiple strikes to sever the head completely. The bodies are often displayed afterwards as a grim warning to anyone considering defiance. The condemned do not spend years on death row. Executions are carried out swiftly, often within the same year a sentence is passed. Until then, prisoners are held in places like Al-Ha'ir prison, a facility infamous for its isolation cells and psychological torment. Inmates are regularly denied contact with their families and left to rot in darkness while they await the day their names are called. Saudi Arabia has a long history of executing minors, despite claiming to have abolished the practice. Abdullah al-Hawaiti was just 14 when he was arrested, tortured, and forced to confess to a crime he could not have committed. He was still a child when he was sentenced to death. Since 2013, at least 15 minors have been executed, including Mustafa al-Darwish, who was put to death in 2021 for an alleged crime committed when he was only 17. Public executions are not hidden away in sterile rooms. They are designed to be spectacles. The condemned are led to execution sites before crowds of onlookers, sometimes in busy squares, other times in the open desert. Some bodies are even put on display for hours after the execution, a practice known as crucifixion, meant not for punishment but for deterrence. Next up, Japan. In Japan, the death penalty is reserved primarily for aggravated murder, with executions carried out by long drop hanging. The country operates 7 execution chambers in major cities, where prisoners are put to death in a highly secretive process. The only crime with a mandatory death sentence is the instigation of foreign aggression, though, in practice, most executions involve multiple murders. However, in extreme cases, a single murder, if committed with torture, brutality, or ransom demands, can also result in execution. Since 2000, Japan has executed 98 inmates. Public support for capital punishment remains strong, with an overwhelming 80% of Japanese citizens considering it unavoidable, according to a 2019 survey. Despite this, Japan's execution system has drawn criticism for its secrecy and psychological cruelty. Legally, executions should occur within 6 months of a final verdict, but in reality, inmates often spend years or even decades on death row, living in solitary confinement, unsure when their time will come. Hanging has remained Japan's sole method of execution for over a century. The condemned are blindfolded, their feet bound, and their hands cuffed before being led to the gallows. In an adjacent room, several officers press buttons simultaneously. Out of these buttons, only one triggers the trapdoor beneath the prisoner's feet. The executioners never know who among them will be responsible for carrying out the sentence. Prisoners are informed of their impending death only a few hours before it happens, typically early in the morning. They don't get any farewells or last-minute appeals, just the cold certainty of their fate delivered at the last possible moment. This extreme psychological torment has been the subject of legal challenges, including a 2021 lawsuit filed by 2 inmates who argued that the late notice system amounted to inhumane treatment. Families are not allowed to witness the final moments in Japan, nor are they given advance notice. Their first indication that the execution has taken place is often a phone call informing them that their loved one is already gone. Finally, Iran. After being sentenced to death in Iran, prisoners are left in limbo, waiting, sometimes for years, sometimes for just a few weeks, before their execution. The decision must first be approved by the Supreme Court and signed off by the head of the judiciary. In theory, their lawyer is supposed to be notified 48 hours before the execution, but in reality, that rarely happens, especially in political cases. Instead, prisoners are suddenly ripped from their cells and thrown into solitary confinement, shackled and isolated, knowing the end is near. Iran has multiple execution methods: hanging, firing squad, crucifixion, and even stoning, but hanging is by far the most common. Most executions happen inside prison walls, either in designated rooms or the prison yard. But when the government wants to send a message, they take it public. That's when the cranes come in. Prisoners are either hoisted into the air or have the platform kicked out from under them, left to suffocate in front of a watching crowd. Death doesn't come instantly. It can take minutes. Meanwhile, their hands and feet are bound, ensuring there's no struggle. For those convicted of murder under Iran's law, it's not just the state deciding their fate. The victim's family is encouraged to be directly involved in the execution. Sometimes, they're even the ones to carry it out. Executions usually take place on Wednesdays, and prisoners waiting for their turn are thrown into solitary on the preceding Saturdays. It's a miserable, dehumanizing experience. They're given nothing but disgusting government food, so bad that most prisoners would rather starve. The blankets stink of urine and vomit. The tiny cells are suffocating, especially in the summer, with no open windows and no clean water. Some prisoners are forced to wash their hands in toilet bowls. Then comes the final visit with the family. It's extremely short, lasting just 10 minutes. The prisoners don't even get a chance to clean themselves up. They are usually filthy, exhausted, and often still shackled. When the 10 minutes are over, families usually refuse to let go, but the guards don't care. They pull the families away, sometimes using force. There are no female officers, so male guards have no problem grabbing women and dragging them from their loved ones. If the prisoner resists, they're beaten, shocked with electric batons, and thrown back into their cell. The execution itself is a mystery until the last second. There's no fixed time. Most of these events happen early in the morning, but some are delayed without warning. Some prisoners don't even realize what's happening until it's too late. Mohammed Ghiyasvand, convicted over a fight, was in solitary for a week before his execution at 8 a.m. He thought he was being taken to see his lawyer before finding out that he was walking to his death. The final nights are the worst. Prisoners usually spend it lying on the floor with their hands and feet tied, staring at the ceiling and waiting. The mental toll becomes unbearable, especially when days turn into weeks and then months and sometimes even years. Anxiety, depression, and run rampant among death row prisoners. With no medical care and no mental health support, many turn to drugs just to get through the never-ending wait. Finally, when the time comes, the prisoner is pulled from their cell and led to the execution chamber. The prisoner is blindfolded, and then a rope is placed around their neck. The judge then reads out the crime and the sentence given. In cases of murder, the victim's family is given a final chance. They are asked if they want to forgive the inmate. If they do, the prisoner's life is spared at the last second, but that almost never happens. After all this is done, a signal is given to carry out the execution. Which of these death row executions do you think is the worst? Is it fair to keep inmates waiting on death row for a long time? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. And before you leave, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Criminal Corner so you don't miss the next ones.